Hello and welcome to another episode of the Modern Maker Workroom. In this episode, we're going to take the next steps in constructing this woman's doublet from the year 1630. If you recall from our previous episode, we made these cuts in the pattern so that you can see how the body is going to be shaped as we make it. Well, now is the time to put that into practice. So we'll begin by placing the pattern on our heavy piece of Melton wool and tracing around the actual edge of the pattern. You want to make sure that you get an accurate representation of all the outer edges, as they will become important later. Now, if you also recall, we drew this line, this nice round line on the body of the pattern, and that gives us the shape that we're going to cut this pad. So I just make a few marks with the pattern on top and in place, and then I use my eye to draw the shape. Now I'm going to add extra allowances around the shoulder and the armhole and the side seam, and that gives me extra room to play with as I manipulate the wool onto the canvas foundation and then manipulate the exterior fabric onto the canvas. We will also be cutting out the back padding out of this wool, even though we won't be using it in this episode. We'll be using it in the next episode. While we have the wool here on the table, we're just going to go ahead and cut it out. As a side note, because I know you'll have questions, we don't need to add extra seam allowances for the back padding. This padding is going to be applied in a very simple way and doesn't require extra allowances to make it work. Here's our front canvas, and we are going to begin by cutting those same slashes into this canvas that we cut into the piece of paper. And you'll see that I'm making them right next to each other. They are approximately 2 chest dedo apart in the armhole and about 3 dedo in depth. So that works out to be roughly 2 to 2¼ inches deep. And then I'll put a similar cut right here at center front at the apex of this front curve. Now that the canvases are prepared and slashed, I'm going to start closing these cuts so that I can begin to have a shape for the canvas. Now, these function just like darts function in a modern garment. However, we're only putting them in the canvas because we want the canvas to be a secure and predictable shape. And then we'll make the exterior wool shrink and fit and mold onto this form. Each cut is whipped closed on both sides. So we start by overlapping by approximately half a dedo. So in this case, that is about 3/8 to half of an inch, depending on what the chest measurement is. And we'll overlap and we'll whip stitch up one side and then down the other. And then I'll take a few extra stitches here at the bottom to secure the tip of the cut and make sure it doesn't come undone. And then I will do this exact same thing on each cut, one right after another. As we move on to closing out the center front, again we are overlapping these edges by about 1/2 of a chest dedo. So in this case, this is about 3/8 to half of an inch. I'll whip stitch up one side, and then I'll turn it over, and I'll whip stitch down the other side. When this is done, once again, when I'm at the base of the cut, I will take extra stitches nice and tight just to secure the opening. Now that I have all 3 of my slashes closed, you can see the hollow that's created, which will allow the bust to sit comfortably. But now I need to take my iron and smooth out all of the lines. So you can see that I work my way from the outside to the inside with the point of the iron reaching where the apex of the curve will be. That gives me the opportunity to smooth my sewing without flattening out the bump that we've created for the bust. Now we'll take our front padding and we will create the same kind of contour, but we're going to do it in just a single manipulation. And we'll do this manipulation in a location that has nothing to do with the location of the other two. One of the beauties of working with darts and their mechanics is that you can rotate them around their center and use the same manipulation, and you will have a similar result. So we're going to take out this 1.5 dado wide wedge from the wool, and then we're going to close this slash, and we'll have a piece of wool that is shaped in such a way that it'll sit beautifully with the canvas, but we won't have created a weak spot in the same place as the cuts and slashes on the canvas itself. And you find this same kind of idea in the way modern suit canvases are made, in that the cuts and slashes are usually in locations that are quite different from where the manipulation is intended. And that means that the tailor needs to understand how these manipulations can be rotated around their axis. For example, when building a modern suit canvas, the tailor will make a slash in the shoulder and insert a wedge of fabric, which creates a manipulation at the front of the armhole. It's this kind of magic that really makes tailoring one of the most interesting ways to apply hardcore geometry to something so beautiful and mundane as a piece of clothing. Our first order of business is to position this pad just so. You can see that I'm focusing on making the pit of the armhole where the wool extends a little bit off of the canvas, but I've got it fairly well balanced. So my next task then is to just baste this piece of wool very lightly and gently in place. I don't want to pull these stitches too tight because when I start pad stitching, I'll need to be able to manipulate the layers. So I'll make this small little hopping catch baste where I'm just taking small picks. It just lightly tacks this in place, making it easier for me to do the work of pad stitching it later. With pad stitching, I want the layers to be able to shift slightly as I'm working, which is why it's so important not to make these stitches particularly tight. In some cases, I've even cut them as I'm working just to loosen up the area and make sure that I have the right kind of sculpting. But now that it's basted into place, I'll thread up a needle and we'll start the pad stitching. This line that I'm marking here is just a general eyeballing for me so that I know where to stop my pad stitching. Because I've cut extra margins onto the width of the armhole seam allowances and the side seam allowances and the shoulder, I want to make sure that my pad stitching doesn't extend too far, because otherwise I'll have to cut through the pad stitching later and razor some of it out in order to finish the construction of the garment. So to save myself some of that hassle, I'm just making sure that I don't stitch where I don't need stitches. You've all probably seen me do pad stitching before, but I will always explain it every time in every video. So we begin just at the most convenient part with my hand in the armhole and the shoulder towards me. And I will take small picks from my right to left, and my stitches are going to be no longer than 3/4 of an inch. Probably for a garment as small as this one, I should keep them to 1/2 an inch, but we'll see what my default stitch length ends up being as we work. Our first pass will be to go all the way around the armhole once, following the guideline that I chalked in place. And then, without turning the work, I will simply shift over to the next row and begin working my way back the other direction. Many people have difficulty with pad stitching because they feel that they need to turn their work, and that's why they lose the effect of the actual shape of the stitches. In pad stitching the shoulder, I'm using the offset pad stitch, which means that I'm not lining my new stitches up with the same level as the old stitches. In fact, I'm aiming my needle and my new stitch at what amounts to be the center of the float of thread from the previous stitch. That's what creates this unique crow's foot kind of appearance. So I will continue just following this piece of wool around. I will pad stitch in circles, um, and I'll just keep going until the entire thing is covered. I'm about 3/4 of the way done right now, and I'm just checking to see that the work is providing the shape that it's meant to, and so far it really is. There's not much more left to go. I'll just fill in this half moon section down around the bust area, and then I will take one extra line of stitching just around the exterior edge to make sure that all of it is properly secured. Now you can see what's under my hand and to the right of the frame. You can see that I've left these large sections that are unstitched, and that gives me the ability to manipulate later. Once I'm done with all the pad stitching, I'll remove my basting stitches so that they don't affect the shape of the garment later on. As with every major step in the tailoring process, once it's done, I will bring my steam iron over and I'll form and cement all of the stitching in place. I can be pretty tough with this because the wool is attached to the linen and it's nice and secure, and if it can't handle the iron, it can't handle years of wear. What I am making sure of, though, is that I'm constantly lifting this canvas, you can see as I'm doing it, because I want to avoid flattening this hollow that we've very carefully sculpted into the canvas itself. Our next step is preparing these outer fabrics to go onto the canvas. And to do that, we're going to begin the shaping process by shrinking a couple of areas just a little bit. First, I'll start with the bust area, and it's not going to look pretty, but what it does is it kind of gets the wool into a slightly shrunken state along the front bust curvature, and that will allow us to sculpt this onto the shaped canvas a little bit more easily. I use a lot of steam and a lot of heat and very little pressure, and what I'm doing with the tip of the iron is I'm just trying to coax this fabric into a smaller area and get it to shrink down. It's a protein fiber, so the chances are it will shrink with steam and heat. It just takes a little bit of work and a little bit of perseverance. As I get closer to the end of it, you can see that I'll actually put a little bit of pressure onto the iron, and that helps to secure the shrink in place just a little bit more. It's never going to be 100% ideal at center front because so much of it is on the straight grain. But what it does is it gets the process started so that it's much easier to get in place when I'm basting down the front. Next, I'll do the armhole, which will be much more accommodating. You can see that I pinched up a little bit and ruched it up in there, and it is just shrinking right in. You can see these little ridges that are happening under the iron as the front of the armhole pulls down. And I'll try to shrink this as much as possible because it will stretch back out as we're working it, and I want it to stretch out to the proportions that we've created in the canvas. I'm cooling it with my hand so that those wrinkles are kind of set in place. I'm doing it very gently. And now you can see, as I show you the canvas here, you can see that it's got that nice hollow in it. In the same way, we're going to try to maintain that by putting the exterior shell on. So I have the body with the center front facing away from me and the armhole and the neckline to my right, and that is for the left front of the garment. Now I'm moving this piece as close to the front of the canvas as I possibly can, and trying to center it. So that looks pretty good to me, and now we can get started with the basting. But I'm really trying to make sure that the hollow in the shell and the hollow that we sculpted into the canvas are well lined up. I'm going to begin my basting right in the middle of the bust hollow, right at the apex of it. And that is because I want to work my way out from the apex of this mound. If I try to work it like a man's garment and started at the top of the shoulder, I think that I would run into problems with misaligning the apex of the fullness. So as I work my way down, you can see that I smooth the wool fabric out in front of the needle with my hand, and then I work a line of basting straight down to the waist. And with each stitch, I'm brushing my finger across the top of the fabric to stretch it onto the linen just a little bit. For the second pass of basting, I have to flip this the other direction, so now the center fronts are toward me, and I'm going to work my way up from the apex of the bust and into the center of the shoulder. And this secures the upper area in tension just the way that I need it to sit. So I'll take my 2 stitches in one place to secure the thread, but then you see I'm using my thumb to spread the fabric onto the linen. And this really, like using my fingers to give the wool these little extra bits of tension, it goes a long way toward making this wool sit tightly onto the canvas itself so that it's holding its own shape. It will make a much more beautiful, much more refined garment in that the canvas is controlling the shape of the garment. You're never having to rely on the body to push out on the canvas 100% to give it the right shape. You're not relying on the exterior fabric either. Everything is run by the canvas itself. Everything is upholstered onto it and it holds the structure. The exterior fabric is more like a veneer on top. With the vertical line complete, our next step is to baste the waist. So we're basting from our main vertical line outward toward the front, and again using my thumb to spread the fabric a little bit as I go. With the front portion done, the next step then is to do the back portion of the waist level. So I had to turn the fabric around, and we'll go back the other way. 2 stitches in one place to secure the basting, and then watch what I do with my hand. See how I smooth that fabric out? That's what you need to be doing every time you start this basting process. Don't try to do this in your lap, in your hands. You really need to do this on a flat surface. It's very important. It's the only way you'll be able to control the way the stretching happens. For my next vertical line, you can see that the center front is once again toward me. And I'm beginning this next vertical line about halfway between the center front and my first line of stitching. The direction that I'm smoothing the fabric, though, you can see that I'm coming out toward center front and up toward the neckline at a slight angle. And this helps control the fabric in what will most likely be something of a hollow in the body as it's worn. Now as we reach the apex, this will help the front sit beautifully around the curvature of the body. Now as I reach the neckline area, I will just move my stitching slightly over and continue up a little bit further. But the important part of the stitching really is what's happening down below, as that smoothing brings the fabric out and up into the neckline. As I begin this line of stitching that's very close to the center front, provided my thread doesn't keep snagging, my apologies. So what will happen is I'll use that upward stroke with my thumb only till I get to where the curvature of the bust is. And then as you watch my thumb, you'll see that I'm starting to drag a little bit of fullness in. You see how up at the neckline, it's not quite even. So I'm going to use my thumb and I'm going to drag a little bit of fabric with each stitch. I'm going to pull a little bit of fullness only on the surface. And what that does is that helps to shrink the exterior fabric down onto that shaped canvas. Again, making sure that I can manipulate very carefully. Now there is a pretty significant seam allowance at center front here, so a lot of what appears to be puckers will eventually vanish away and be hidden on the inside. All you'll be left with is this fantastic shaping that sits so beautifully over the corset. Now that I'm here at the neckline, I'm going to change my motion. I'm going to follow the curve of the neckline, and I'm using my thumb to draw the fabric. I'm smoothing the fabric towards the cut edge of the neckline at a perpendicular angle. And I'm taking small diagonal bastes, and the diagonal bastes have more to do with the fact that I want to control the curvature and the shaping. And as I just showed you, you're not catching the wool padding in these stitches. You're just catching the exterior fabric and the canvas. I've rethreaded my needle and now I'm going to work on the shoulder. I'm sorry that I'm almost out of frame. I didn't realize quite where the camera was aimed. But you see how I'm arcing up with my fingers underneath so that this fabric is sort of naturally tuned to rolling over the top of the shoulder. Once I get to the outer arm or the armhole edge, I'm going to turn the work and I will once again do these diagonal bastes around the armhole itself. Now, you can see that I'm using my thumb to pull the fabric into the armhole. And as I reach the area where I have shrunk in some fullness, I'm also making sure that that fullness is carefully secured. As I turn, you can see the way the light hits it, and you can see the fullness that's coming in there. Now again, this fullness is functioning like the darts that are used in modern women's wear. But because this style of doublet in the time period did not have any darts at all, we're using tricks of the tailor's trade to get that shaping in place without seeing any visible darting whatsoever. Now that I've reached the end of the armhole, I can cut my thread and move on to the next section. The next line of stitching comes up at an angle, beginning with the intersection of the waist and my first vertical. I am aiming a diagonal line towards the top of the blade. You can see the blade is the tip top of the side back seam. And you can see how I'm smoothing. I'm almost curving the fabric up and into the armhole. And this tension will help create a bit more of a hollow under the arm. That manipulation, along with one that we will create after all of this is sewn together, really helps fit the garment beautifully around the side of the body. The final line of stitching is worked a couple of dedo in from the cut edge of the side back seam. You look at the motion that I'm smoothing with my hand. I'm smoothing down and toward the corner of that waist. And what this does is it also aids in creating a hollow around the side of the garment so that it follows the contours of the female figure without causing too many wrinkles. This is my final line of basting, and now that this is done, I am going to give it a little bit of a steam press. So again, I'm starting with the areas that I've shrunk. So the armhole is one of them, and this time, because it's secured onto the canvas, I can be a little bit more forceful with the iron, using extra steam and lots of heat and pressure to try to get that fullness to just minimize down into this nice little horseshoe-shaped armhole. Now I'm back at the center front, and I'm doing the same thing. I'm using the steam and the heat to try to reduce the fabric down so that it's as smooth as possible. Okay, the next step then is to baste around the exterior edge. And now if you'll look at how I've got this held, I am holding it with the exterior face down, and I have rolled that front edge up. And this is me making sure that I'm basting it in a way that relates to how it will be on the body. This garment is going to be around a cylindrical shape. Therefore, if I am basting like this with it rolled up, I'm already displacing the layers in a way that makes them sit nicely on the body. Other than the direction that I'm rolling it, there's not a whole lot of technique to basting around the exterior edge. I'm just using a quick baste. I'm going across the point right now. There's no magic to that. This is all just very basic. At this point, the majority of the shaping has already been completed, and our goal at this point is to just do the final securing of the exterior edge onto the canvas. Once this is done, then I'll trim away the excess canvas and we'll have a garment front that's ready to go. I do want to point something out here as we work our way up the side back edge, that this edge in particular should be kept quite loose with the stitches, and that has everything to do with the fact that once this whole thing is done and we've trimmed away the excess fabric, this particular edge is going to be stretched with the iron. So we want our stitches to be nice and loose so that we have the opportunity to stretch this edge without the stitches binding our ability and stopping us from stretching as far as the fabric wants to go. And I'll just go around the armhole and the shoulder, and then we'll be done. Trim away the excess seam allowance. Now we're going to be trimming away the excess allowance out of everything but the shoulder. We've done all of our stretching and manipulations of the surface fabric, so it is secured where it needs to be. So we can now trim flush with the edge of the fashion fabric on the outside. And we'll do this all the way around, and then we will leave the shoulder allowances where they are. Because of how the shoulder is constructed, we want all of those allowances as additional potential support inside the shoulder once the seam is sewn and everything is put together and fit. Our very final step is to stretch the side back seam. Now this is something I mentioned earlier when we were basting up. We left our stitches loose so that we had this opportunity. Now you can see all I'm doing is I'm putting the iron along the edge, and then I am intentionally stretching and pulling that edge. The iron isn't going very far into the fabric. I'm only got about 2.5 inches, just maybe 5 or 6 centimeters. And by stretching in this location, we're moving a shaping to the interior of the garment that makes it sit better on the human body. Thanks so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.